Everything was going like clockwork. Decorated hall, guests with smiles on their faces. The groom was waiting for his bride at the altar. It seemed like the perfect day to start a new family. But suddenly, right before the cherished words were spoken, a 10-year-old boy abruptly stood up from his seat and shouted, "Stop!" His voice pierced the hall, and everyone present froze in disbelief. What he revealed at that moment changed forever not only the wedding, but the lives of everyone who was there. What would you do if you heard such an unexpected truth? Write in the comments and tell us where you are watching this video from. We are interested in who is with us today. When everyone turned to look at the boy, the silence in the hall became unbearable. The groom, his father, froze, trying to figure out what was going on. He knew that his son rarely spoke so harshly and confidently, especially in such moments. The bride looked at the child in confusion, trying to keep calm, but her face turned pale. She clearly knew something had gone wrong. The boy moved closer to the altar, his footsteps echoing through the hall. He was at a loss, but his eyes were determined. Something important had to be said. His small hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. "You don't know who she really is, Dad. She's hiding the truth from you." The child's gaze shifted to the bride, her face set in stone, as if she was preparing for what was about to happen. All the guests looked at each other, not understanding what was going on. The groom, now wary, took a step toward his son. "What do you mean, son? What are you talking about?" he asked, trying to calm the situation down. But the boy continued, "She was deceiving you. She's not who she says she is. She's lying." The bride stepped forward, her voice trembling, but she tried to defend herself. "It's all a misunderstanding. He's just a child. Don't listen to him. He doesn't know what he's talking about." But the tension was growing. The groom couldn't take his eyes off his son. His intuition told him that there was something more behind that cry. The boy took a small envelope from his pocket and handed it to his father. "Here, look at this. You should see it for yourself." Everyone around held their breath. The groom opened the envelope and there were several photos inside. His face changed, first surprise, then shock, then anger. He looked at his fiancée, who was now trying to hide her panic. His voice was almost hoarse, barely containing his rage. The woman, apparently, could no longer deny the obvious. Everything was clear. Those photos exposed her double life, her lies that had been carefully hidden until that day. The man, shaken and unable to cope with the surging emotions, quickly took out his phone and dialed 911. At this moment, it became clear that the situation had gone far beyond the family scandal. This was something much more serious that required police intervention. Sirens filled the air a few minutes later. The guests left the room in a panic as the bride was led away under the gaze of those who a moment ago believed in her innocence. When my father, clutching the phone in his hands, heard the voice of the 911 dispatcher, his face turned white as chalk. He walked slowly over to his son, trying to make sense of what was happening. And the bride, who was standing a little further away, lost all the sparkle and confidence that she had been full of just a few minutes ago. "What are these pictures?" he asked in a choked voice, directing his gaze to the woman he was planning to marry. His voice was laced with pain and anger. There was a flicker of panic in her eyes, but she still hoped to convince him that everything could be explained. But that was impossible. The pictures that the boy took out of his pocket showed the bride, but not in the perfect image in which she appeared to him. These photos showed her in a very different light. Meetings with unknown men, hidden conversations, suspicious transactions. It was too much. Behind each photo was the truth that she had tried so hard to avoid. Now all her lies had come out, and it was at the most inopportune moment. "That's not true. You must understand. This is all a mistake. Someone is deliberately trying to ruin our wedding." Her voice was trembling, but she tried to maintain a little bit of confidence. "This kid, he doesn't know what he's doing. This is manipulation." But my father wasn't listening. He looked back at his son, his eyes filled with questions and pain. "How did you know about this?" he asked softly, feeling the ground give way beneath his feet. The boy sighed. "I've seen her a few times. She thought I wouldn't notice. But I knew. I could hear her talking on the phone, seeing who she was dating. I couldn't just watch you make that mistake." Silence filled the hall. The guests who were still left were silently watching the drama unfold before their eyes. Some tried to leave without attracting attention. but most stayed, unable to tear themselves away from the scene of the ruined wedding. The bride tried to take a step forward, her hands shaking. "You can't help but believe me, can you?" Her voice cracked. "I love you. It's all just a coincidence. You can't trust a child's words." But her father looked at her with cold determination. "You lied to me. All this time, you lived a double life, and I was blind. How could I trust you?" There was a bitterness mixed with desperation in his voice that only added to the tension. At that moment, the sirens of police cars cut through the evening air. The guests looked at each other, and someone started to leave the hall, not understanding how this wedding turned into a real nightmare. When the officers entered the hall, they immediately noticed the tense situation. Her father showed them the photos, and the bride stood in the corner like a trapped animal, unable to come up with an excuse. "I didn't want it to happen like this. I thought I could fix this." Her voice was low now, almost a whisper, as if she was talking to herself, not believing what was happening. The officers approached her, and she realized that there was nowhere to run. She couldn't deny it any longer. Everything was exposed. Her lies, her secrets, her double life all shattered in one moment when the boy, her future stepson, dared to tell the truth. The man watched her being led away, his heart breaking with pain and betrayal. All the dreams he had made of a new life, a happy family, were now destroyed. He was grateful that his son had opened his eyes, but there was still a void inside. When the hall was empty, the father went to his son and hugged him. "Thank you," he whispered. "You saved me from a terrible mistake." The boy hugged him back, knowing he'd done the right thing, but feeling the weight of the truth. This day was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, but instead it was the end of a story that should never have begun. They were standing in an empty hall, where the heavy plume of recent drama still lingered. Father and son were embracing, as if only now realizing how fragile this illusion of a perfect wedding was. It was getting dark outside, and the sirens were still ringing in my ears. The father slowly released his son, looking into his eyes with gratitude, but also with pain. Everything he knew about life, about love, seemed to collapse in this lonely moment. "I don't even know how you did it, son. How did you have the guts?" he asked softly, trying to control the thoughts swirling in his head. The boy looked at his father with a seriousness that was not typical of his age. "I couldn't let her keep lying to you. You deserve the truth, even if it's so cruel," he said, his voice firm, but his eyes still revealed a childish vulnerability. It was hard for him to see his father so ruined. My father sighed heavily and ran a hand over his face, trying to calm the headache. "I couldn't even imagine that things could go this far. I was sure I knew her. I think you can never be completely sure of people." His words hung in the air like a bitter lesson that fate had taught too unexpectedly. He glanced around the room. The bright wedding decorations now looked like a mockery of what had happened. Suddenly, a sound came from somewhere in the corner, as if someone had forgotten to turn off the microphone. Father and son turned sharply. It was a video camera that kept recording the entire scene. My father went over to it and turned it off, but the recording was already done. He knew that this moment would be remembered not only because of the memories, but also because of this video. This day will never be erased. It will become part of their history, part of the pain they will have to overcome. But that wasn't the end of it. A few hours later, when the father and son finally returned home, the phone rang again. It was the police officer who had taken the bride earlier. The voice on the other end was serious. "Mr. Jackson, we need you to come to the station. We've managed to dig up something about your case, and it's not just about the wedding." My father stiffened. How many other secrets did this woman hide? What secrets could be revealed now? When they arrived at the police station, my father was prepared for anything, but what he found out shocked him even more than the revelation at the wedding. The police said that the bride, in fact, was connected with a criminal group engaged in fraud and money laundering. Her goal wasn't to build a family. She planned to use him for her own purposes, gaining access to his finances and connections. My father sat stunned, listening to these horrifying details. "She was going to rip me off," he whispered, unable to believe that his love was just a cover for such dark deeds. The policeman nodded. "Yes, she was part of a major scheme, and your intervention saved you from serious problems. We've been following her for a long time. but there was no proof until you provided us with these photos." My father suddenly realized that this was not just an emotional tragedy, it was a real danger. And his son, this small, brave boy, not only saved him from a personal disaster, but also from something much bigger. It was late when they got home, but the house was quiet. The father was sitting in the kitchen, looking at nothing, and his son quietly came and sat down next to him. "I know it's hard for you right now, Dad," the boy said, breaking the silence, "but you're stronger than you think." My father smiled, though his smile was bitter. "I do not know what I would have done without you," he confessed, putting his hand on his son's shoulder. "You didn't just save me today, you showed me how important it is to listen to ourselves and to those we love." That night, they both realized that life isn't always predictable, and sometimes it throws up punches that you can't be prepared for. But despite everything that had happened, they knew they could handle it. After all, they had each other, and no amount of lies or secrets can destroy them anymore. When the father and son returned home from a visit to the police station, there was no sense of relief. The cop's words still echoed in his head. "It was all a setup. She used you." But one thought kept nagging at him: was this really all about money and cheating? Or was there more to it than that? A few days passed, and my father tried to return to normal life. But after what happened, it was not easy. Every time he left the house, he was surrounded by curious stares from neighbors and colleagues. News of the wedding and the revelation spread through the city like lightning. Even in the small cafe where he often went for breakfast, customers whispered behind his back. Over time, however, Jackson began to notice that there was more to the whisper, not just curiosity, but a kind of judgment. People no longer looked him straight in the eye, and some people started to avoid him. He knew this wasn't a normal discussion of a scandal. It had to do with what happened at the wedding and who his fiancée was. One day, as my father was leaving the store, he noticed a middle-aged man who gave him a pointed comment as he passed by. "That's what happens when you get involved with people like her." Jackson froze in place. His heart skipped a beat, and it was only after a few seconds that the meaning of what he was saying came to him. He realized that it wasn't just about her cheating. People around us began to notice another aspect of the story: race. His ex-fiancée was a white woman, and he and his son were African American. At first, Jackson tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just bad language. But the comments got louder and more unpleasant. He was soon confronted with something he hadn't expected: a growing dislike based on racial prejudice. It started gradually, but it became more and more obvious. The son complained about strange looks at school. Some teachers began to treat him with some suspicion, and the neighbors seemed to avoid him and his father. It seemed that the exposure of the bride at the wedding had awakened something dark in their society, old prejudices that had surfaced at the most inopportune moment. One night, as Jackson was sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee, remembering his conversations with the police, his phone rang. It was a colleague whom he considered a friend. "Look, Jackson, I'm not sure how to tell you this, but I've heard some guys at work talking about your situation. And they don't just mention her fraud." The voice on the other end was clearly nervous. "What do you mean?" Jackson felt an uneasiness begin to build in his chest. "Some believe that all this happened for a reason. They say that you and your son should stay away from certain places. You know what I mean. There are still people in our society who are not ready to accept such relationships." Jackson paused. Many thoughts raced through his mind. Did all this hatred have to do not only with what happened at the wedding, but also with who they were? With the fact that he is an African American and his fiancée is a white woman? Was their relationship the target of such an old-fashioned and dangerous prejudice? The next day, he came to work and felt it even more clearly. His colleagues avoided his gaze. Conversations broke off when he appeared, and the entire office seemed tense. Only one colleague came up to him and said softly, "People are talking. You know how it is. But if you want my advice, be careful. Not everyone is ready to see families like yours." Jackson nodded silently. His anger was slowly building up, but he couldn't vent it. He knew that racism, which was always present somewhere in the background, but seemed like a forgotten topic, could not be fought with just words. This evening, he decided to talk to his son. They sat down at the table, and Jackson noticed that his boy was clutching his spoon, picking nervously at the food. "Have you noticed that people are treating us differently?" he finally asked. The boy nodded, not taking his eyes off his plate. Yes, Dad. At school, too, the teachers are acting weird, and some of the kids, they say it's because you were going to marry a white woman. My father felt his heart tighten with pain. He didn't want his son to face such things at such an age. Look, this isn't right. People can be cruel and unfair, but it's not our fault. What happened shouldn't have affected us so much. But unfortunately, racism is something that many people still live with, although they don't always show it. But you know what? We can handle it. The boy looked up at his father and nodded, but it was clear in his eyes that he was still trying to understand why people could hate them so much just for who they were. Meanwhile, the situation in the city began to escalate. Jackson began receiving anonymous threatening emails. You'll pay for this. You don't belong here. These were just some of the messages. He realized that the matter was no longer limited to preconceived notions. Racism, hidden deep beneath the surface, rose up like a volcano, and now their lives are in danger. Late one night, when the father and son were about to go to bed, they heard a commotion in the street. Jackson looked out the window and saw a cross burning on his lawn. The darkness they had felt around them in the last few days was now palpable. It was a symbol of hatred, an ancient sign that had once again risen in their lives. Jackson realized that the situation was becoming dangerous, and it was impossible to stay away any longer. He decided to seek help, starting a fight against not only personal drama, but also against those who tried to destroy their lives because of hatred for their race. When Jackson saw the blazing cross on his lawn, his heart sank with fear, but even more so with anger. It was a symbol of hatred that always seemed like something far away, from a past that couldn't be imagined in his modern world. But now this horror was right in front of his house, right in front of his son. The fire danced against the night, illuminating the street with a dark and frightening light. Jackson quickly grabbed his phone and dialed 911 to report the incident, then raced to the door to get his son out of the house. The boy was already standing in the hallway, trembling with fear. Dad, what does this mean? Why are they doing this? His voice was trembling, but his eyes were already filled with fear, not just of the symbol, but of what was hidden behind it. It's hate, son, Jackson replied, trying to stay calm even though he was seething inside. These are people who are afraid of what they don't understand, but I promise you, they won't win. He hugged his son tightly, knowing that he had to show him his strength even when he was in shock at what had happened. Soon, sirens sounded on the street, and several police cars stopped in front of his house. The officers quickly extinguished the fire, but traces of hatred remained. They took photos of the crime scene and started asking questions, but it was obvious that this wasn't just a random act of vandalism, it was a threat. The investigating officer approached Jackson with a serious expression on his face. It's not just a symbol, Mr. Jackson. Someone clearly wants to hurt you. We will increase our patrols in your area, but I advise you to take precautions. Such cases rarely end in a single event. Jackson nodded, though a growing sense of unease grew inside him. He couldn't understand why all this was happening now. After the wedding, was it because of his ex-fiancée, or is it a deep-seated hatred that was just waiting for its moment to surface? The next day, the situation only worsened. Rumors of the burned cross quickly spread throughout the city. In the shops, people whispered, and at school, his son began to notice even more angry looks and whispers behind his back. One of his classmates came up to him during recess and said with a grin, "Your father deserved all this. There was no need to mess with the whites." The words were like a stab to the heart. The boy, unable to hold back his tears, ran home. When he returned from school, he couldn't hide his tears from his father. "Why do they say that? We haven't done anything wrong to anyone." Jackson sat down next to his son, his heart breaking that his boy was facing such cruelty. "I know this isn't right, son, and I know how much you're hurting, but it's not about us. It's about them, about those who can't accept that the world is changing, that we shouldn't live in the past, where people were judged by the color of their skin. It's about the fear that they can't control." But words couldn't mitigate the real threat that loomed over their home. That same night, Jackson received another anonymous threatening email. "Get out of our town before it gets worse." Read a dirty piece of paper. Now it was clear, those who hated them because of their skin color would not stop at one burnt cross. The next day, Jackson decided to take action. He sought help from a local human rights activist who had long fought racism in their neighborhood. The local press began to pick up the story, and soon it was being talked about not only in their small town, but also outside of it. People started asking questions. In the 21st century, how can such acts of hatred occur in a society that pays lip service to equality and justice? But it also caught the attention of those who were willing to defend Jackson and his son. Soon, local activists and neighbors began to gather in front of his house, who, despite the haters, wanted to show their support. They carried placards reading "No to racism," "We are all equal," and "Hate has no place here." This was an unexpected twist. While the hatred seemed to divide them, it led to people rallying against it. But the haters weren't going to give up without a fight. Graffiti with racist slogans appeared in the city, and stones were thrown at Jackson's house several times. However, he decided that he would not leave. Now it was not only his personal struggle, but also a struggle for the future of his son, for the future of those who might find themselves in a similar situation. A few weeks passed, and more people joined their cause. Jackson spoke at town meetings, telling his story, raising issues of racism that many chose to ignore. He became a symbol of resistance, a man who did not give up in the face of hatred. And even though the fear still lingered deep inside him, Jackson knew he wasn't alone. His son, now surrounded by the support of friends and neighbors, has learned an important lesson. The world can be cruel, but you can't let hate win. After all, strength isn't just about surviving adversity, it's about turning it into an opportunity to make a difference. And one day, sitting on the porch with his son, watching their friends and allies gather outside, Jackson said quietly, "We can handle this. We are more than their hatred." Even as Jackson and his son began to receive support from the community, fear and tension continued to build. With each passing day, the hatred seemed to grow more aggressive. Clouds were gathering around them, and Jackson sensed that they were constantly being watched by someone who didn't want their voices to be heard. One evening, as Jackson was returning from work, he noticed a strange car parked in his yard. His breath caught in his throat. He quickened his pace, knowing that this might be another threat. He had encountered several aggressive stares on the way, but this time the feeling of unease was growing. As he got closer, he saw that a man he knew was sitting inside the car, one of his former colleagues, with whom he had once worked together. "Jackson, sit down. We need to talk," he said with a worried expression. Jackson got into the car, not sure what exactly was going on. "What's wrong?" he asked, his heart pounding in anticipation of the bad news. "I have information. I heard they were going to do something scary. It has to do with you and your son. You have to be careful." His voice trembled, as if he was afraid to say it out loud. As Jackson listened, his fear only deepened. He knew that racism and hatred were only growing in their city, but he couldn't even imagine that it could get to this point. "What are they planning?" he asked, trying to remain calm. "They say they're going to give you some sort of lesson to show you that you don't belong here. They want to do it publicly, and it could end badly. I don't know the details, but you should be on your guard. I can help you leave if you need to." Jackson felt a wave of horror wash over him. He didn't want to hide or run away. He wanted to fight, but he didn't know how to protect his son from the hatred that was about to tear their world apart. "I can't just run away," he said, suppressing his confusion. "I can't let them get the better of us, but I need to know how to protect my son." The man looked at him with understanding. "I can't control everything, but maybe I should get the police's attention. You might even want to contact the media. Let everyone know what's going on." The next day, Jackson and his son decided to take action. They organized a meeting with local activists who had previously supported them and reported on the situation. Together they made a plan. In the evening, they gathered a large group of people and went to the city hall to hold a rally against racism. Jackson spoke to the crowd, and his words touched hearts. "We will not hide. We will not be silent. We are a family, and we have the right to safety and love." The gathered people supported him, and the atmosphere became charged with positive emotions. But even so, Jackson could feel the tension building, as if there was a threat in the air, and as if his instincts were right. Shortly after the rally, when they returned home, the situation got out of hand. Late at night, when the whole family was already asleep, Jackson woke up to a sharp noise. He stepped out into the hallway, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw that the door to the house was open. Glancing around the room, he noticed that his son was asleep, but something was wrong. Shouts rang out from the street. Jackson ran outside and saw a group of people gathered on his lawn. They had flags and slogans in their hands, but their faces were distorted with hatred. "Get out of here, Jackson," one of them shouted. "Your ideas and your color are not needed here." Suddenly, one of the men in the crowd snatched up a rock and threw it through the window. The glass shattered, and it was like a thunderclap. Jackson tried to shout for them to stop, but his voice was drowned out by raucous laughter and screams of hatred. He realized that now he had to act, otherwise everything could end tragically. "Son, inside, now," he shouted, hoping that his voice might wake the boy from his slumber. At this moment, he could feel time slowing down. He had to protect his son at all costs. But the crowd only grew larger, and in the chaos, one of the men, clearly under the influence of alcohol, pulled out a baseball bat. He walked towards Jackson with a wild expression on his face. "Do you think you can change the city? Do you think we'll let you take it?" Jackson gritted his teeth and stepped forward, putting himself between his son and the aggressor. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, and he knew this situation could end badly, but he knew he couldn't back down. Suddenly, he saw his son running out of the house, standing behind him with a horrified look on his face. "Daddy, don't!" the boy shouted, his voice filled with fear. Jackson, seeing his son, lost all hope of a peaceful resolution of the conflict. At that moment, sirens rang out in the crowd. Police cars pulled up in front of their house, and the lights from their flashing lights lit up the night. Jackson felt his heart swell with hope, but the haters weren't going to give up. They started shouting even louder, and one of them threw the bat on the ground, but the others threw words of hatred. The police got out of their cars and tried to disperse the crowd, but Jackson knew it wouldn't be easy. "We are defending our rights," one of the aggressors shouted, clenching his fists. At this time, the crowd became even more aggressive, and one of the policemen, seeing that the situation was getting out of control, began to try to separate people. Jackson stood there, not knowing what to do. He tried to protect his son, but he could feel the hatred growing like dark clouds. Suddenly, the crowd attacked the police, and a fight broke out. Jackson felt that time was being compressed, and everything that was happening around him seemed to slow down. He didn't know what to do, how to save his son and himself. There were shouts, hand-to-hand fights, and panic in the air. Just as Jackson was about to rush to his son's defense, someone in the crowd grabbed his shoulder. It was one of the haters, and he grabbed him and pushed him out of the way. Jackson felt anger and fear wash over him. "You can't stop it. You and your son aren't needed here," the man shouted. And at that moment Jackson couldn't help but respond. He gathered all his anger and shouted in the face of the hater, "We are here to stay. We won't leave or hide." This shout seemed to strike the crowd like a bolt from the blue. Suddenly, attention shifted to him. People began to slow down. Some even stopped fighting, but the hatred didn't disappear. It only accumulated like rain before a storm. At that moment, one of the police officers came closer to Jackson and his son. "Go away. I'll deal with this," he shouted, but there was confusion in his voice. Jackson knew they couldn't just leave. As the crowd began to close around them again, Jackson took a step forward, shouting, "We're not afraid of you. We are all human beings. We have the right to live as we want." But in response, there were only taunts and aggressive shouts. It wasn't just a confrontation, it was a struggle for existence, for the right of his son to grow up in a world free of hate. As Jackson stood on the threshold of his life, his words seemed to hang in the air like sparks in the mist. He could feel the confusion growing inside him, and the adrenaline was making his heart beat faster. His son, who was standing behind him, was trembling in fear, but there was also a glint of determination in his eyes. This was the time when they had to show that hatred couldn't break them. At this critical moment, one of the policemen, seeing the growing tension, came closer and tried to calm the crowd. "Hey, we will not tolerate violence. If you don't disperse, we will detain you," he said loudly, but his words had no effect. The people in the crowd, baffled, just kept yelling, everyone taking up the general anger. and Jackson could feel the hatred building to the limit. Suddenly, one of the activists standing next to Jackson whipped out his microphone and shouted, "Listen up, we're not here to fight, we are here to show that racism and hatred have no place in our society." This phrase suddenly caught the attention of a part of the crowd, but not those who were aggressive. "You don't need to come here," one of the aggressors shouted as he made his way to the activist. His eyes were blazing with anger, and his fists were clenched so tightly that the veins in his arms were straining. "Get up before we hurt you." The shouting and swearing grew to an alarming scale. Jackson knew the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. He turned quickly to his son. "Son, move back and stay closer to the house. I don't want you to see this," he shouted, but the boy stayed where he was, holding a small sign that read, "We are all equal." Just this simple message that his son was holding seemed to stop the hatred for a moment, but not for long. The shouts and threats rang out again, and the crowd began to close in on Jackson. Suddenly, one of the men in the crowd threw a rock at Jackson, and it caught him in the shoulder. Pain shot through him, but he wasn't going to back down. He felt that this was not just a personal struggle, it was a struggle for his son's future, for a world in which he could live without fear. As soon as the police tried to intervene, several haters threw stones in their direction. A scuffle broke out, and increasing violence began to fill the streets. "This isn't going to end well," one of the officers shouted as his teammates began cracking down on the crowd. Jackson realized that they were at risk of losing everything: their son, what they had built together, and their freedom. Realizing that time was running out, he raised his hands to attract the attention of everyone around him. "Listen to me, this is not a solution. We can't continue this cycle of hatred." But the only response was giggles and shouts of disdain. One of the men, encouraged by the support of his companions, stepped forward. "You're not welcome here. Go back to your block," he shouted, making Jackson furious and terrified at the same time. Jackson wasn't going to keep quiet. He felt that his words might be the last hope of reconciliation. "We are all here to live together. We can't continue as if we don't exist. I won't run away and hide from you. I will stay here for my son." At that moment, Jackson suddenly saw his son. The boy was still holding the placard, his face contorted with fear, but there was a desire to fight in his eyes. It reminded Jackson that his fight was not just for himself, but for the future of the next generation. That was the last straw. Meanwhile, the police continued to try to disperse the crowd, but their efforts were futile. Jackson knew that if they didn't take steps toward reconciliation, it could end in disaster. Suddenly there was a crack, and one of the aggressors pulled out a gas canister. He pointed it at Jackson and started spraying gas. Jackson felt the stinging mixture enter his lungs. He started coughing and choking. Seeing this, his son, realizing what was happening, ran forward, looking for the strength to protect his father. "Daddy, don't be afraid," he yelled, rushing toward Jackson. Just as the rest of the crowd started throwing rocks, one of them hit the boy in the forehead, and he fell to the ground, losing consciousness. Jackson, overcome with pain and tears, rushed to his son. It was a moment when time seemed to have stopped. He scooped up his son, his heartbeat blending in with the boy's. "Son, son," he repeated, but only silence and the threat that loomed over them answered. Soon the police, realizing that the situation was getting out of hand, began to use force to disperse the crowd. Jackson, holding on to his son, could feel his rage rising. He realized that they couldn't give up. He picked up his son and, ignoring the heated crowd, walked towards the police officers. "Help me, my son," he shouted, his voice breaking through the noise and chaos. The police, seeing the boy's condition, quickly rushed to their aid. They helped Jackson get to the ambulance, and as his son lay in his arms, Jackson felt all hope draining from his heart. In the hospital bed, his son lay with his head bandaged, and Jackson, unable to hold back the tears, looked at him. He knew that their lives had changed forever. The battle they started won't end just like that. That was just the beginning. As Jackson sat by his son's bedside, he suddenly felt a new spark of determination ignite in him. He knew he had to keep fighting not only for my son, but for all those who faced hatred. At that moment, he decided that they would become a symbol of resistance. They didn't just survive, they had to live to talk about their struggles. A few days later, when his son finally regained consciousness, Jackson hugged him, feeling love and hope fill his heart. "We are together, and we will continue this battle," he whispered, and there was strength in his voice. This battle was not only personal, but also shared, and in this unity they found their strength. Every day, with every speech, they fought against hatred and discrimination, attracting more and more people to their work. They weren't alone. Hatred couldn't stop them anymore. Even though there was a bigger fight ahead of them, Jackson knew that with love and support, they could overcome any evil. Every step they took became an important part of their story, a story of struggle, hope, and victory over hatred. Despite the ordeal that Jackson and his son went through, this tragedy reawakened their resolve, which only grew stronger with each passing day. In the hospital, watching his son slowly recover, Jackson knew that their fight against racism and hatred was just beginning. He felt the need to tell his story in order to draw attention to the problem that many families in their community are facing. As soon as his son started to recover, Jackson made a decision. Together, they will become activists who will fight for equal rights and justice. He knew that unity is a strength, and decided to create a support group for local residents who are faced with racism. This group was supposed to be a platform where people could share their stories, find support, and organize anti-hate protests. One day, when his son began to move confidently, Jackson called into his house. "Son, do you know what we've been through? This should be our motivation. We are not alone, and we have a voice. We have to use it," he said, holding his son's hand. The boy nodded, his eyes full of determination. He also felt that their mission should be heard. The following week, Jackson and his son began actively preparing for the first rally they planned to hold in the park. They printed out flyers, made posters, and spread information on social networks. Jackson invited people who witnessed the events at their wedding, as well as those who knew of the hate in their neighborhood. He wanted everyone to feel that their voices were important, that they could be part of something bigger. It was the day of the rally, and when Jackson and his son arrived at the park, they were overwhelmed by a wave of emotions. The people who supported them had already gathered there. Jackson felt a surge of energy when he saw many of them holding placards with slogans about peace and equality. It was more than just a struggle for one's family. It became a movement against the systemic racism that permeated all sectors of society. When Jackson stepped onto the podium, his heart was pounding with excitement. "We are here to say that hate has no place in our world. We have come to protect ourselves, our children, and our neighbors from this plague that is eating away at our society," he said with complete conviction. Loud cheers and shouts of support rang out from the crowd, and it gave him confidence. However, not everyone was ready for a peaceful dialogue. Among those gathered in the park were opponents who began shouting insults and demanding that Jackson leave their city. It only made him more determined. He continued to talk about how important it is to unite against racism, how important it is not to be silent when such terrible things happen, like those that happened to him and his son. At that moment, Jackson saw among his opponents the man who had been one of the men who had attacked him that night. His heart began to beat faster. It was personal. It wasn't just a protest. It was a fight for my family and my identity. "We're not going to run away from you. We will not let hatred break us," he shouted, his words echoing through the park. The crowd around him applauded, and Jackson felt the support that flooded through him. He knew they weren't alone this time. People came from their neighborhoods to support each other and share their stories. It wasn't just about them. It became a movement against racism, hatred, and bias. But soon they were approached by the police. Jackson could feel the tension in the air. The police started asking if they had permission for the rally. It was standard procedure, but there was something more to their voices and expressions: hostility. He knew that they would not be able to avoid a collision. "We have the right to gather here," shouted one of the activists standing next to Jackson. "This is our territory, and we won't leave." The police, seeing that the crowd was getting agitated, started to approach. Jackson knew they needed to stay calm. "Don't fall for provocations. We are here for peace," he shouted, trying to calm the people around him. But the hatred has already escalated. One of the opponents, supported by the others, started shouting, "You are not needed here. Get out of here before it's too late." As they drew closer, Jackson knew the situation was about to spiral out of control. Suddenly, there was a thud in the crowd. One of the policemen was pushed, and from that moment the panic began. People began to run in different directions. Shouts and tears were heard everywhere. Jackson couldn't let his son be in the middle of this mess. He grabbed his arm and started dragging him to the side, trying to find a safe place. However, as they tried to make their way through the crowd, one of the opponents grabbed Jackson by the shoulder and spun him around. "You can't run away from this," he screamed, and Jackson felt a surge of terror. But in that moment, he remembered what they were here for: their family, their son. "I'm not running away," he shouted back, his voice filled with determination. At the same time, the police tried to disperse the crowd, but this only led to more chaos. Jackson felt his heart skip a beat. He saw that his son was looking at everything with a frightened expression. "Son, don't be afraid, I'm here," shouted Jackson, wrapping his arms around the boy and hugging him to him. He understood that this situation could end badly, and his goal was not only to defend his rights, but also to protect his child. Finally, with the help of several activists and police officers who tried to restore order, Jackson and her son managed to find shelter. They were hiding behind a car, and Jackson tried to calm the boy, who was shaking with fear. "We're safe, son, hold on tight," he whispered, feeling his own heart beating in unison with his son's. Through the noise and chaos, Jackson began to wonder just how deep the roots of racism were in their society. He understood that the hatred they were facing wasn't just a random outburst. It was a systemic evil that spanned entire communities and created hatred between people simply because they were different. After the situation calmed down a bit, Jackson and his son came out of hiding. They saw that the rally had been suspended, but people were still standing in place, waiting to continue the conversation. Jackson felt the need to return people to their original goal of fighting for justice and equality. He went up to the podium and shouted, "We can't let hatred divide us. It's not just about us. This is about all those who have ever experienced bias. We must unite to stop this evil." His words sounded like they were lifting everyone up from the depths of despair. The crowd froze in anticipation, and soon people began to applaud, their ranks gathering again. Jackson continued, "Our strength is in unity. We must show that hatred cannot win. We need to tell our children that they can be proud of who they are and that they are entitled to their dreams." Jackson's words caught the attention not only of those who were at the rally, but also of passers-by who stopped to listen. This was what they all expected: unification, a common goal, a common hope. The sense of community is stronger than ever. The moment Jackson saw his son standing next to him with a placard in his hands, he knew that this movement, this struggle, this is their future. They will fight for anyone who has experienced bias. They will use their voices to be heard, to create a world free of hate. Thus, the story of Jackson and his son became not just their personal struggle, but a symbol of how to resist hatred and racism, how to unite people and create a society based on love and understanding. This was just the beginning of their journey, the path they intended to follow until they saw hatred vanquished and love triumphed. Jackson continued to speak, his voice becoming more confident and powerful, as if he was drawing strength from the crowd itself. He saw how people who had previously been separated by hatred were now coming together in a single spirit. Their cheers and shouts of support grew louder, and it gave him an extra boost. "We are not here to create conflict. We are here to create a dialogue," he continued. "Each of us has the right to be heard. All of us have the right to respect, regardless of our skin color, religion, or origin. Hate can kill, but love and unity can heal." Jackson's words started to resonate in people's hearts. He noticed how smiles started to appear in the crowd, how people started hugging despite their differences. Everyone realized that they were on the verge of change. At this point, Jackson decided that they should do something more. They need to create not just a rally, but a driving force that can change society. He suggested creating a permanent support group that will focus on education, organizing social events, and helping those who face racism. "We have to learn from each other. We need to understand that every story is important," he said. "Let's get together every month, share our stories, and plan how we can improve our community. Let's be the ones who inspire change." The idea was met with cheers. People started discussing how they could help, what resources they had to support this endeavor. Jackson felt a spark of hope ignite in him as he watched his dream come true. His son stood by, proud and delighted that their story had had such an impact. A few days later, Jackson called the first meeting of the new band. People from all walks of life gathered in a small local center. There were parents, young people, elderly people, representatives of different nationalities. They all came to discuss how they can change their communities. At the meeting, Jackson suggested creating a program where local residents can share their stories about racism and bias. By listening to each other, we can figure out how to break down the barriers that divide us, he said. He called on everyone to share their experiences to show that no one is alone in their suffering. As one by one people began to stand up and speak, Jackson felt his heart swell with pride. As he listened to stories of people being humiliated based on their race or color, he realized that this wasn't just his fight, this was the struggle of many people, and now they could band together and fight together. On one occasion, a woman who introduced herself as Laura spoke about how her family faced bias when they moved to a new neighborhood. We were just an ordinary family looking for a new home, but every time we went outside, we were looked at with disapproval. I heard the neighbors talking about us. I thought my kids didn't deserve this, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. Her story brought many people to tears, and people started hugging each other to show their support. Another participant, a man named Carl, shared his story about how he was the victim of racist attacks just coming home from work. I didn't do anything wrong, except that I looked different, and now I can't help but look back every time I leave the house, he said, his eyes filled with bitterness. These stories made Jackson more determined. He realized that they weren't just gathering to talk, they were gathering to act. He suggested creating plans for events that would focus on education, communication, and changes in local politics. By the time the meeting came to an end, the participants agreed that they would meet every month. They decided that their first big event would be dedicated to the memory of all those who suffered from racism, and should become a symbol of unity. From that moment on, something more began. Jackson and his group began organizing protests, seminars, and educational events for children and adults. They began collaborating with local schools to offer courses on racism and bias. Many people started coming to their meetings, and Jackson was amazed at the number of people who were willing to support the movement. However, there were still other challenges on the horizon. Not everyone agreed with their goals. A group of opponents who initially came to the rally also began to act. They used social media to incite hatred and spread false rumors about Jackson and his band, claiming they were inciting hatred against white people. Jackson knew it was going to be a tough fight, but he knew they couldn't let fear and hatred get the better of them. He was going to lead his group through these trials while remaining strong and determined. One day, when Jackson came to a meeting, he noticed that several aggressive people gathered at the door with posters and shouts. These were the same people who tried to disrupt their rally. "You are not needed here," one of them shouted as he walked towards a group of activists. "You only incite hatred." Jackson could feel the tension building. He quickly turned to his group, and they started forming a circle to protect each other. "Don't pay any attention to them," he shouted. "We are here for peace. We will not return hate for hate." However, the tension in the air was palpable, and many felt fear. Jackson knew they had to stay united. "This trial will only strengthen us. We must show them that hatred cannot break us," he said, trying to inspire them. Their group decided not to succumb to provocations. Instead, they started singing songs about peace and unity, and this helped reduce the tension. Over time, they began to be joined by passers-by who were also against hatred. Their voices grew louder, creating an atmosphere of unity. Despite the aggression, Jackson understood that every action, every meeting, and every word of support was a step towards change. Soon they began to receive support from local organizations, and activists from other cities began to join them. This was a noticeable signal for the opponents. Jackson didn't lose hope. He could see their efforts beginning to bear fruit. Over time, they were able to organize a large event that brought together thousands of people in support of equality and justice. It was the day when hatred gave way to love, and together they stepped forward into a new era full of hope for a future free of racism and bias. Although there were still many challenges ahead, Jackson knew that he and his son were not alone in this struggle. Their story became a symbol of the struggle for justice, and they were ready to continue their mission until hatred was finally defeated. Jackson and his son, Kyle, knew their fight was just beginning. After a successful rally that attracted thousands of people, they faced a new challenge. While the public began to support their movement, there were also those who were not going to give up. A group of opponents, led by one of those who attacked Jackson during his wedding, began to act more aggressively. One evening, as Jackson was returning home, he noticed that he was being followed. At first, he thought it was just paranoid thoughts, but when he turned the corner, he saw a group of people standing in the shadows. Their faces were hidden, but he could feel their hatred. His heart beat faster as he realized that these were the same people who had been at the rally. As Jackson got closer to his house, he saw Kyle playing outside. The boy was laughing and shouting merrily, not suspecting anything. This moment of happiness was interrupted when one of the figures from the shadows shouted, "Look, he's come, let's teach him a lesson." For a moment, Jackson froze, and his instincts kicked in. He rushed towards his son, shouting, "Kyle, get back!" As he ran, a group of people moved forward. Jackson's heart pounded as he realized that he had to protect his son at all costs. Suddenly, one of the attackers grabbed Kyle's arm. "Let him go!" shouted Jackson, his voice filled with rage and fear. He rushed forward, fighting those who tried to harm his child. The situation quickly escalated as the fight broke out in front of Kyle's eyes, and Jackson could feel the darkness engulfing him. Several neighbors ran out of their homes after hearing the screams. Someone called the police. Jackson, trying his best to draw attention away from Kyle, felt his strength drain. He knew that he couldn't lose this battle. He had to protect his son. When the police arrived, the situation was already in full swing. The police quickly broke up the fight, but Jackson saw that several of the attackers had managed to escape. His heart clenched with fear and anger as he realized that they wouldn't just leave. Kyle clung to his father, shaking with fear. "Daddy, I'm scared," he whispered. Jackson hugged him, trying to calm him down. "It's going to be all right, son. I'm here with you. I will never let them hurt you," he replied, feeling his own heart break with fear for his child. A few days after the incident, Jackson and Kyle visited a doctor. Fortunately, they weren't seriously injured, but the physical injuries were nothing compared to the emotional injuries. Kyle, who had always been energetic and cheerful, became withdrawn and quiet. Jackson remarked that his son couldn't forget the terrible moment when he was captured. Jackson, realizing that he needed to act, decided to see a psychologist. He hoped it would help Kyle get over it. In the first session, the boy was sitting on a chair, his hands nervously fidgeting with the hem of his t-shirt. The psychologist asked in a soft and supportive tone, "Kyle, can you tell me what happened?" Kyle fought back tears. "I was just playing, and then they came. They grabbed me, and my dad was screaming." His voice trailed off as tears rolled down his cheeks. "I'm scared when I think about it," he finally said. Jackson felt his stomach tighten with pain for his son. He knew that he needed to find a way to restore his confidence and calmness. At the next meeting with a psychologist, she suggested that Jackson and Kyle try group therapy with other children who had experienced similar situations. Jackson, though unsure, agreed. He knew this might be a good opportunity for Kyle. Group therapy was helpful. The kids started sharing their experiences, and Kyle soon noticed that he wasn't alone in his fears. With each session, he became more open, and communication with other children helped him gradually cope with the trauma. At the same time, Jackson continued his activist activities. He organized another rally to raise awareness of racism and aggression in their community. This time, he invited local leaders, educators and psychologists to share their thoughts on how to improve the situation and ensure safety for all. When the day of the rally arrived, Jackson took to the stage again. He noticed that people came with their families' moms, dads and children to show support. It reminded him of what they were fighting for. "We are here to say that hatred and fear have no place in our society," he began. His words resonated with the crowd. "But we are also here to support each other. Each of us has the right to feel safe. Each of us has the right to be ourselves, regardless of skin color or culture." At that moment, Kyle, who was standing next to him, raised his hand. Jackson turned to his son, and there was so much determination in his eyes. Dad, I want to say something, he said. Jackson felt a surge of pride. He nodded, letting Kyle take the microphone. With a tremolo in his voice, the boy began to say, I was scared when these people grabbed me, but now I know that my dad will protect me, and I want other kids to know that they can be protected, too. The crowd reacted enthusiastically to the boy's words, and Jackson felt that their efforts were beginning to bear fruit. After the rally, Jackson noticed that several parents approached him to express support. They offered assistance in organizing events, creating programs for children, and much more. That was the moment when Jackson realized they weren't alone. Their movement attracted attention and support, and they were able to change their communities for the better. But shortly after the rally, Jackson noticed that his family was beginning to get negative attention. Angry comments and threats began to appear on social networks. Some even called for violence against him and his son. Every time he opened his phone, a sense of dread would come over him. He knew that his activism had led to him becoming a target of hate. One evening, as Jackson was returning from work, he noticed that someone was following him. He felt his heart beat faster. After quickly checking the situation, he saw the same silhouette that had been chasing him. Once again, Jackson felt the same fear that had gripped him on that terrible night when his family had been attacked. Without waiting for the situation to become dangerous, he hurried home. Kyle noticed his father's worried expression and asked, "What's the matter, Dad? What's wrong?" Jackson tried to stay calm. "Nothing, son, I'm just a little tired," he replied, but inside he was filled with anxious thoughts. The next few days were tense. Jackson began to exercise caution, avoiding places where people might be waiting for him. He talked to some of the neighbors who expressed support, but he knew this could only be the beginning of something more serious. Nevertheless, Jackson continued to participate in the promotions because he understood that it was important, but each meeting was filled not only with determination, but also with fear. Fear for your son, fear for your family. He knew that in this world where hatred could manifest itself at any moment, they had to be prepared for anything. One night, while she and Kyle were watching TV, the doorbell rang. Jackson tensed, feeling his heart skip a beat. He went to the door and saw through the peephole a woman dressed in black. She looked tense and nervous. Jackson opened the door, and a woman who turned out to be his neighbor ran inside. "Jackson, I need to talk to you," she said with a worried face. "I saw a group of people gathering outside your house. They look menacing, and I think they've come for you." Jackson felt a wave of fear creep over him. "What are we going to do? What is it?" he asked her. They knew they had to act quickly. He grabbed his phone and dialed the police number, simultaneously deciding that they should hide. "Kyle, come here," he shouted, his heart pounding. As Jackson and Kyle got ready, there was a commotion outside the window. Jackson's heart sank when he saw the group of people the neighbor was talking about. They stood on the sidewalk, shouting loudly and waving placards with hateful slogans. A sense of hopelessness was building inside him. The police finally arrived, but when they saw how many people were gathered, Jackson felt that it became even more dangerous for them. He watched as the police tried to disperse the crowd, but this only fueled the conflict. People with placards continued to shout, threatening Jackson and his family. Kyle clung to his father, trembling with fear. "Dad, I don't want anything to happen to us," he said with a childish fear in his voice. Jackson hugged him, trying to be strong. "I'll protect you, son. I'll do my best," he whispered, not knowing what would happen next. As the crowd began to swell, Jackson made a decision. He knew that he might have to leave this city to protect his son and himself, but before taking this step, he felt that he had to express his feelings. He went to the window, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "Listen to me. I'm not here to incite hatred. I am here to fight for my children and for our future. We are all human beings, and no one has the right to decide who is worthy of life and who is not." His voice cut through the crowd. Suddenly, everyone froze, and Jackson felt that maybe his words could still reach out to some hearts. It was the moment when he realized that even in the darkest situation, they could still find light. As Jackson spoke his words, his voice filled with determination penetrated the hearts of many in the crowd. He noticed that some people started whispering, and a light of understanding lit up in their eyes. This moment seemed completely magical. but it was quickly interrupted by the sound of boos and shouts from the crowd. The feelings of fear and hatred, as if awakened by his speech, began to build up again. Despite the efforts of the police, it was not easy to incite hatred among those gathered. One of the opposition leaders stepped forward, waving a placard with offensive slogans. His words were filled with rage. "You have no right to tell us how to live. You are not needed in our city." Jackson, who could feel the tension building, knew he had to act to stop it. He turned to Kyle, who was still clinging to him, and said, "Son, stay here, I'll be back." He took a step toward the door, ready to go outside and face the people who hated them so much. After gathering his strength, he went outside and saw that the police seemed to be losing control of the situation. "Listen to me, we're all people here," he shouted, raising his hands to calm the crowd. Instead, some of them started throwing objects at him, shouting insults. Kyle was scared. He watched his father stand alone as the crowd grew more aggressive. The boy felt like he should do something to help. Determination crept into his heart. "I can't just sit here and wait," he thought. Kyle, feeling a surge of courage, ran out into the street. He ran past the police and stood next to his father, squeezing his hand tightly. "Daddy, I'm with you," he said, his voice trembling with fear, but there was a light of courage in his eyes. Jackson was shocked. He didn't expect Kyle to come out to him, but his heart swelled with pride. "Thank you, son, we'll do it together," he said, hugging the boy tightly, but the crowd was still closing in on them, and the tension was building. At that moment, one of the neighbors, an older man named Mr. Brown, stepped out of the crowd. His face was full of determination, and he stepped forward and said, "You are not alone. We are here to support you." With these words, other neighbors joined him. Some started coming out of their homes, while others simply approached Jackson and Kyle, forming a ring of solidarity. This unexpected turn of events slowed things down. Jackson glanced at those who had come to support him. Their assembled faces expressed unity and support. It gave him strength. "We won't put up with hate," he shouted again, feeling hope begin to fill the atmosphere. The crowd, made up of opponents and supporters, now faced a new challenge. The angry group began to split, some of them beginning to wonder if they really wanted to continue this violence when more people were calling out for peace. Mr. Brown went on to say, "We can't let hate define our community. We must unite, regardless of skin color, to create a place where our children can grow up without fear." His words resonated with many, and the tension in the air gradually began to subside. Kyle, watching all this, felt his fears begin to fade. Together with their father, they stood holding hands, surrounded by people supporting them. Even among those who came with hatred, Jackson noticed that some started to turn away, others whispered about what was happening. But at this moment, the aggressive young man who was ready to continue the conflict came out from the crowd again. "We can't just let them do this to us," he shouted, and his words rekindled old emotions. The situation began to escalate again. Jackson, sensing the threat, picked up the microphone again. "We don't want war, we want unity," he said, his voice once again loud and confident. He looked at his son and hugged him, adding, "I won't give up until we find a common ground. For our children, for the future." A moment of silence hung in the air, and then someone in the crowd, a young woman, began to applaud. Gradually, others began to join in, and the applause began to grow. This gave Jackson hope that his voice was being heard. However, he wasn't destined to know how this battle would end. The situation was still unstable when the police tried to separate the two sides, and just as the crowd began to split into factions, Jackson's neighbor, Deborah, ran up to him with a horrified look on her face. "Jackson, they're coming for us," she shouted, pointing at the group that was approaching them. They were the same opponents who had once stood on the other side of the street. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. "Kyle, stay close to me," he said, feeling the fear creep over him again. Seconds turned into hours as he watched the tension build as the group of people came closer and closer. "We can stop this," he said to everyone. "Let's just talk. We are not the enemy." But his words seemed to drown out in rage as the crowd started shouting again. The police intervened, but they also seemed unable to control the situation. Another fight broke out. Jackson felt that he and his son were cut off from everyone. He knew he had to protect Kyle at all costs. Then, in the midst of all the chaos, Kyle suddenly broke free of his father's arms and charged forward. He stepped between Jackson and the approaching men. "Stop!" he shouted. "We don't have to fight. We should be together." It was incredibly bold. Jackson felt his heart beat faster. The entire crowd froze, and suddenly there was silence. Jackson didn't know how people would react, but he could see that Kyle, standing there, was a symbol of what they were all trying to achieve. The crowd began to whisper, "It's just a kid," someone said. "He's right," said another, and while many were still filled with hatred, some began to wonder what makes them. In that moment, Jackson realized that hope was still alive. Kyle was what they all wanted to be, a voice of reason in the chaos. And even as the tension grew, Jackson felt unity begin to take over. After all, everyone was there to protect their families, and they had to find common ground. "We can do this," Jackson said, raising his hand to try to connect with the crowd. "We can find peace. We must work together to create a better future for our children." With that, he saw some people start nodding in agreement. He felt the tension begin to ease as a deeper understanding began to take hold of people. Soon, Jackson's words and Kyle's boldness began to make an impact. The steady roar of applause rang out again, and this time it was filled with hope. It was a signal that they could overcome their hatred and become stronger together. Despite the fact that this evening remained in the memory as one of the most difficult moments of their lives, it was a turning point. Jackson knew their fight wasn't over, but they weren't alone now. They now had the support of their community and, more importantly, the hope that unity was possible. As Jackson and Kyle stood on the street, surrounded by people supporting them, the tension in the crowd gradually began to subside. However, there were still a lot of questions left. As hopeful as his words were, Jackson knew that hatred didn't just disappear. This hatred was rooted in history, and overcoming it required work that they had to do together. However, among those who came to support them, Jackson noticed that some were still skeptical. Mr. Brown, the older neighbor who had taken a bold step forward, continued to speak, but there was still hatred in some people's eyes. It was evident from their sullen faces and the whispers that rang out in the crowd. Jackson couldn't ignore it. "Let's talk about what separates us," he shouted, trying to keep the peace. "Why can't we just talk like humans?" But his words hit a blank wall. One of the opponents, the same young man who had shouted insults earlier, stepped forward again. His voice was hollow and menacing. "You come to our city and think you can dictate how we live? Why should we tolerate your presence?" "Because we're all human beings," Jackson said, trying to control his emotions. "We all have the right to a peaceful life. Do you want your children to grow up in a world free of hate?" However, his words were once again met with disdain, and Jackson understood that hate doesn't always go away. Even if you try to talk about love and understanding, he could feel his heart pounding as he watched some of the neighbors who once seemed like his friends step back. They were not ready to accept his call for peace. Kyle, still standing next to his father, began to notice how this negative interaction affected everyone around him. He saw the tension building between the two people, and fear gripped him again. His childish innocence couldn't understand why adults couldn't just solve their problems in peace. Regret shot through his heart. As the crowd began to grow again, Jackson suddenly felt the need for action. He knew that he wouldn't be able to sleep, knowing that the hatred continued to exist, and his son wouldn't be safe. He looked into Kyle's eyes, and when he saw the boy biting his lip nervously, he decided to take action. "Kyle, I want you to stay with Mr. Brown. I have to talk to those who don't understand what's going on," he said, looking at his son confidently. Kyle didn't want to let go of his father, but he knew it was necessary. He nodded and walked over to Mr. Brown, who hugged him and promised to protect him as if he were his own grandson. Jackson stepped forward, his heart beating faster. He approached a group of people who were still expressing hatred and anger. "Look, I understand that you're afraid," he began, holding up his hands to calm them. "The fear of change, the fear that we are not like each other. But is that really a reason to hate?" Some of them began to whisper among themselves, and Jackson felt his words begin to reach them. He continued, "I was there myself. I know what it's like to feel like you're different. I know what it's like not to find yourself in this world. but that doesn't mean that we can't be part of the same society, that we can't live in peace." Despite his words, Jackson noticed that the leader of the opposing group, the same young man, had once again stood up. "You don't know what you're saying. You and your people will still be strangers in our city," he shouted, his eyes burning with hatred. Jackson could feel his own anger rising, but he held it in. "Why do you think so? Is it just because we don't look like you? Isn't that selfish?" he said, trying to keep his voice calm. And suddenly, a woman who had witnessed all this came out of the crowd. She was white, with hard features and expressive eyes. "I myself faced bias when I was young. I also felt hatred, but I realized that this was wrong. Hate only breeds more hate," she said to the crowd. Her words caused some people to be surprised, while others started laughing. Jackson felt that he was beginning to feel hopeful. Perhaps this will be a turning point. Perhaps they can unite against hatred, but he knew that the work had only just begun. But before he could answer, that same young man shouted again, "What do you know about us? You've never felt what we feel. You don't know what it's like to see your city change." By this point, Jackson was exhausted. He felt like he was losing control of the situation again. "Why can't you see that your vision of the city narrows you down? Instead of being afraid of change, we can learn from each other," he shouted. But suddenly, an unexpected twist occurred. One of the younger men from the opposing group, a man who hadn't interfered before, came closer. "Maybe we should really give it a try," he said, his voice quieter than the others. "Maybe our children deserve a better world." This question turned out to be critical. The hatred that had previously filled the crowd started to burst at the seams. Jackson felt hope fill his heart again. Maybe, just maybe, they can create a dialogue. Kyle, standing with Mr. Brown, looked at his father with pride. He felt that together they could do something meaningful. The crowd also froze, and some began to nod in agreement. It was a sign that the struggle of Jackson and everyone standing nearby was not in vain. "Yes, let's talk," said the woman who supported Jackson. "If we want our children to be able to play together, we need to start understanding each other." The screams of hatred began to subside, and voices of understanding began to be heard against this background. The conversations became calmer, more reasonable. This moment was the first step towards breaking down the barriers that separated them, but it was only the beginning. Even so, Jackson knew there was still a lot of work to be done. This conflict is only a reflection of the deeper biases and fears that are ingrained in society. He knew that change took time, patience, and, more importantly, a willingness to listen to each other. At this time, he felt determined. He had to protect his son, not only from hatred, but also from the bias that lurked at every turn. He knew it was going to be a long road, but now he had a community that was willing to work together. "We can all be part of the solution," he said, and in that moment Jackson realized that they were fighting not just for themselves, but for the future. This was the beginning of a new chapter where hope could flourish and love could conquer hate, if only they were all willing to work together. After long hours of intense communication, when hatred and misunderstandings began to give way to understanding and solidarity, a sense of hope hung in the air. Jackson, Kyle, and their neighbors felt the walls of prejudice and fear begin to crumble. Finally, a common language was found among the assembled people. Discussions became more in-depth, and many started sharing their stories. There was a woman who grew up in a nearby neighborhood, and she described how her family faced bias when they moved to the city. She shared her pain, but also how she overcame difficulties and how her neighbors helped her become part of the community. People began to realize that they have a lot in common, that they all want a bright future for their children. This shared interest became the basis for creating connections. Some neighbors who were previously hostile to Jackson and Kyle began to approach them, apologizing for their words and actions. "I didn't realize what you were going through. We are all human beings here, and we all deserve respect," one of the men said, fighting back tears. Jackson, feeling his heart swell with pride, reached out and hugged him tightly. Kyle watched it all with a big smile. He could feel the belief that the world could change growing in his heart. He was part of something important, and it gave him strength. Despite all this, Jackson knew that the job wasn't finished yet. They agreed to meet regularly to continue discussing issues of racism and bias in their community. Soon, a committee was formed, which included representatives of all groups, to create training and interaction programs. The committee became a framework for collaboration between different communities, and over the next few months they worked on programs that will allow people from different cultures to meet and interact. Kyle's school organized cultural days where children could share their traditions and customs, teach each other, and make connections. As time passed, Jackson noticed how the atmosphere in their neighborhood was changing. People had become more open and friendly. They began to come together to solve problems such as security, education, and landscaping. Together, they worked to create a park where they could meet and spend time with their families. At the opening of the park, which took place a year after that memorable day, Jackson and Kyle stood among their friends and neighbors. They watched the children play, laugh, and communicate, unaware of the divisions that once existed. It was a picture that filled their hearts with happiness. On this day, when Jackson spoke to the audience, he felt a surge of pride. We've come a long way and I'm proud that we did it together. Hate has no power over us when we stand together. We are a family, he said, and everyone started cheering. Kyle, standing next to his father, knew they'd done something important. He found real friends and support among people who previously seemed like strangers. Not only was he able to share his story, but he was also part of a change that affected many. As the evening drew to a close and the sun began to set, Kyle looked at his father with pride. "Dad, I'm proud of you," he said softly. Jackson smiled as he hugged his son. "No, son, I'm proud that we did it together. This is just the beginning, and we have a bright future ahead of us." With this, they returned home full of hope and plans for the future, knowing that together they can overcome any difficulties and create a better society for themselves and their children. Thank you for being with us on this powerful journey of hope and understanding. We would love to hear your opinion on this story. What do you think of the message of unity and overcoming bias? Have you ever had any incidents of racism in your life? And how did you deal with them? Your stories are incredibly important to us, and we value each and every one of you. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss out on new inspiring content. Your support is very important to us. We wish you a wonderful day.